A warm welcome back. My name is Tom, and this is Get Nuanced with TJC. Thanks in advance for tuning in with me today. I'll have both a video and an audio version, as originally I am recording this on my new Nord 200, which I actually will have a follow-up review. Apologies, I had an unboxing originally, but the recording actually was screwed up, so unfortunately I did not get to have it completely done, but I will make up for that fact on my tech channel over at youtube.com/tjcmn. The link will be in the description below. Subscribe if you haven't already to that. But anyways, just wanted to give a heads up on the equipment I'm using for this content, as well as also explain the change of scenery, which is actually what's going to help me segue this into the main topic of the video. So for the last week I was able to visit my folks up in my hometown in New York City, despite the fact that now, as of April, I've been over in Tampa for 7 years, and I'll get more into that in another subject, but I wanted to do some content on Tampa, New York, and just my experiences overall, which I'm going to incorporate into this video among others, as well as, if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast. But I normally talk about international relations, current events, and world history with the particular focus at the moment of Greco-Roman history. At the moment, I'll expand upon that later. But I wanted to start doing other content as well, especially since I had a very great experience earlier, a chance encounter, if you would say, and it was only because of the fact that I was able to visit my folks over here and, square up some loose ends, I guess, in lack of a better term, or I guess tie up would be the more apt phrase. But anyways, knowing what I mean, obviously, I was able to come up here and catch up, as well as be able to exercise over at my favorite spot, which is a few blocks away from where I grew up, over by a beach, which has a wonderful view of the New York City skyline, as well as a great sort of overview of the Atlantic Ocean, or at least the coast of which on the east. And the area I grew up in was one of the oldest areas of New York City, actually. I'll actually have a link, and probably overlaid on this video somewhere, I have some B-roll footage that I'd love for you all to take a look at if you're on YouTube. If you're not and you're on the podcast, click on the link below to see it. And I'll have a timestamp with any luck, as I hopefully don't forget to include that. But needless to say, the view, I would say, and hopefully you'll agree if you see it, was pretty captivating. I love and I appreciate it much more now that I haven't been able to spend as much time as I'd like up here, coming back and forth for mostly the holidays and the summer, but in between spending the bulk of my time, as many of you know, based in Florida, which is not a bad place either. I mean, there's many great places here in America, and I'll talk about that now in a sec, but I was fortunate enough, now getting back to the main crux of the story, to be able to longboard every day recently. The weather's been pretty good. Today it was actually, as of the time I was recording, the day before the summer solstice of 2022, it was June 19th at the time, or June 20th actually. June 21st, I think, is the solstice. And I'll talk about the history behind that, obviously, in another segment. There's interest in that, I think, from a historical perspective that could be a topic in and of itself. But needless to say, it was like 70 degrees, 74, not a cloud in the sky, low humidity up here. I mean, in contrast, I'll be back in Tampa not too long from now. And the humidity down there is, during at least the summer, pretty bad. I mean, most of the city where I am currently based is based around what was formerly a swamp, where the Seminole tribe used to be primarily the lords of that particular domain. One of the only undefeated Native American tribes, actually, interesting enough, which could be its own topic again. I mean, Osceola was a famous figure, actually, for example, that had a lot of his name everywhere, including the name of a couple of high schools, which I think a few people I knew attended. But not to get into Florida history now, to get back to New York here for the sake of the video and not to ramble, I was able to actually stand and enjoy the view for a little bit. I had the leisure time, which unfortunately not everyone, I hope you can all say the same, but for many I know increasingly, and this will get into more of what I'll talk about when it comes to politics, at least domestically in the United States, leisure time and time in general is a commodity that is incredibly scarce in our current economy. I mean, the way that it's even phrased, I think, is sort of a perversion of the original notion of such. I think leisure time shouldn't have to necessarily be predicated on the same profit-motivated logic of at least capitalism here in the U.S., which, listen, I'm not in far-left commie or anything like that, but at the same time, I'm not a doctrinaire libertarian anymore, and I think that there should be some sort of mixed model, but I can talk about that later, and I also think that there's good parts of capitalism as well as bads, as well as with every ideology that should be looked at accordingly. But to note when it comes to time, I mean, I was able to spend an hour over by the pier basically, which oversees, and hopefully you'll see with the video, the entire city skyline from where I live, the borough that I live at. And fortunately, I was able to stay there long enough, and I got the idea to record the B-roll, which you'll probably see. And while I was doing that, actually, an older gentleman was able to, I guess, have the time as well to come up to me and ask what I was up to. I explained it, and long story short, I had a very great 30-minute, 20-minute long, 25, 30-minute, I'd say, like somewhere in between conversation with him. The fellow was born in 44 and was, 77. Much, 3 times older than I am. I only just turned 25 last year. I'm one of the younger millennials born in 1996, for better and for worse. But I was able to have a pretty decent conversation, and he brought up a couple of things. Beyond the fact he was talking about, which I think should be its own subject, the old Staten Island, which is the place that I grew up at, and talked about how the differences in terms of the times were based around the fact that he grew up and was my age around 1969, 1968, which was the beginning of the Nixon administration in his first term, and a quite turbulent time in U.S. history, right around the time actually when inflation, I think, was in a similar, or maybe not as similar, but at least not in terms of the specific circumstances. I know the oil prices back then, and also the sort of re-questioning of Keynesian economics was something that was at the time, and the beginning of neoliberalization in the 1970s, particularly afterwards, not too long after, were things that were looming in the shadows of the current that situation. But in our current times, which I'll get into obviously with in other segments, the Ukraine Russia situation, along with the competition increasingly with China, as well as the situation overall with just inflation post, with this sort of, I guess, lack of a better term, since it isn't exactly over yet, but the sort of post initial pandemic shock that occurred starting in March of 2020, or at least that was when it really took a pace in the United States, and the rest obviously is developing history as we speak. But considering all of that happening and having a similar sort of circumstance growing up at the time, I thought, it would be decent to share some of the things that he and I discussed a little bit, not going to talk about the exact specifics, that really helped me actually kind of formulate the type of thoughts that I've already been having, but really kind of encapsulated them in a way that I thought was perfect for this sort of video, which were already things that I was looking forward to discussing in other subjects, and I brushed upon them before in others, but I thought that this would be a great way to sort of collect it all together and form one particular video and podcast subject for you all to, take as food for thought, if anything else. But he was discussing actually how he used to play at a bowling alley that no longer exists, and it made me remember that I've been actually tuning into multiple other YouTubers as well as reading myself, and this is something I recommend if you haven't already heard of it. I'm sure it's been in the zeitgeist recently again, and has resurfaced. When it first came out, there was a lot of criticisms and rebuffs, but this is in particular Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which was published in 1999, and its primary thesis basically underlined the sort of belief that there was a clear decline in the social fabric of the United States, especially at the end of the 20th century, and talking about how there was a downward spiral basically of the sort of civic and public, life of the country. Talking about, like, for example, when one thinks of these sort of civic or public notions of what it means in America to have these sort of spaces, they're very different. I'd say it's stark juxtaposition now in the early part of the 21st century versus what were the case when my parents were growing up in the 60s and 70s, as well as when this gentleman actually was growing up in the 50s and 60s, which kind of overlap. They're different generations, but not too far off. My parents and him were like probably 14, 15 years different, but it's still, I think the truth of the matter is still remaining so, in the sense that, my parents, for example, they met at a bowling alley, and this book, Bowling Alone, underscores how, the institutions and different sort of facilities that would sort of necessitate and enable, I'd say, in lack of a better term, the socialization of various peoples, networking in a way, which is something I'm particularly interested in, and which I've done plenty in downtown Tampa, attending startup events and trying to just interact with everybody. I used to, for the 5 years, and I'll talk about my opinions after living there for over half a decade, of living in downtown Tampa, I made a lot of use of Curtis Hickson, the waterfront park, with an interesting history. The name of the park is named after a mayor of Tampa, Curtis Hickson, who was a mayor in the 20th century and had some dubious connections with the mafia. But it's interesting, and I mean, clearly it didn't tarnish his reputation enough to where a park wouldn't be, where the park was named after him still, for better and for worse, as well as the new Julian B. Waterfront Park, which was recently converted from the Waterworks Parks. Not to get into Tampa, but in particular, I just wanted to talk about how, as living outside my hometown now for 7 years and being able to travel around the country a good bit, coast to coast, I've been able to fortunately say I've been to California before and much of the Northeast. The only state so far, a couple of states that I haven't visited yet that I definitely want to get to on my bucket list in the immediate future is Texas and Colorado, most likely, but most of the other states that I've had an interest in, I was fortunately able to go visit via either a road trip or flight or some sort of event, one other means or another. And I was able to actually visit many of the places and see for myself common trends, and I'm sure others who've lived in these types of places actually could attest to the sorts of things I'm talking about. But when you think of these spaces, at least traditionally, you would think of public swimming pools, the library, public parks, like I mentioned before. Uh, Malls, in particular, actually, is something that I was able to see plenty of. My favorite being the Sawgrass Mill in Fort Lauderdale, which I was able to visit and during a Thanksgiving back in 2017 with my friend and her family, as well as my girlfriend, and we were able to see during Black Friday the hectic tumult of cars being parked in areas that definitely they shouldn't be, and people scrambling during Black Friday, which was a unique experience, as well as the, I think, Providence Place, particularly the mall in downtown Rhode Island, or downtown Providence in Rhode Island, which was a very great place that I was able to fortunately visit, thankfully, during a trip to my friend who lives over there, and see. I think that was one of my favorite places too. Their Uno Pizzeria is actually pretty far. I mean, just my opinion on that. But I've been able to see, as well as the mall that I grew up around near me, the Staten Island Mall, as well as the malls that are very close to where I live now in Tampa, which is not the greatest one. You had its heyday in the 70s as well, which goes back to the main subject of the video. But many of the malls, actually, which I had a couple of friends way back when, where we would visit several across the state of Florida, and the eerie sort of fact of the matter was that much like Bowling Alone was talking about, and the fact that this gentleman was talking about how the bowling alley that he went to no longer exists near me, as well as the one that I think I mentioned that my parents met at, that no longer exists as well. Many of the malls that I've been to, many of the malls across the country, have really been sort of gone hand in hand with the sort of revival of 80s music, the synth wave, and it really feels eerie in visiting some of them, as half of them are either some stores maybe here and there, but for the large part, you can clearly tell they've seen better days, and the functions that they had and the businesses that they used to host have clearly been mostly shuttered, and the places that are still operating, there's so much empty space that sometimes you would think, I mean, I visited mostly during the day when they were open, but during the night you could probably go back if you're not supposed to, if you're loitering or something. I've not done that myself, but I'm sure that some are interested. I know that there's a whole culture behind visiting and documenting with the filter, that makes it look like it's from the 20th century, the retro one. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. The malls that are, they kind of seem haunted. I mean, from the sense, not from like, I'd say like a ghost demon sense, but haunted from the fact that they sort of embody this sort of nostalgia that many of those in my generation, who's I'd say like the millennial Gen Z generation, which I'm like right in the middle of that. Some have called it zillennial, but I'll just say I'm, a late millennial. But mostly because Gen Z, I always try to, joke around with my girlfriend because she's born 99. I always try to say, oh, you damn Gen Z people, but you damn Zoomers. But jokes aside, I mean, there's a lot of overlap, I'd say, with the beginning of one generation and the ending of the one that's immediately concurrent to that one. Say, for example, the Gen Xers who were born in 66 and 65, probably having more overlap with the boomers, which are the former generation, than the sort of younger millennials, versus the fact that younger millennials, probably, or older millennials, the ones in their 30s already, like my cousins, are more inclined to be in the sort of, similarity with the later or the younger Gen Xers. But that's just obvious, I think, going without saying. And it's something I'm interested in when it comes to demographics and ages and how they correspond with, the historical context of their upbringing, because the coming of ages, obviously, maybe distance separated as just a decade or two, can have a significant sort of effect when it comes to the understanding of the cohort and their place in their world, I mean, for better and for worse. But that sort of thing aside, going back again to the main subject here, and really appreciating that conversation. I doubt that gentleman will have seen this video, but it really helped me put into sort of the context in my head, this ADHD head that I have that is always constantly processing information, but to no avail, obviously, when it comes to trying to make sense of the world, and particularly the United States, as well as the subjects I often talk about. It really does seem like something when it comes to nostalgia that we're all currently, I mean, I'm guilty of that myself. I mean, I often find myself looking back at the memories that I've had. I have a decent photographic memory, as well as looking back at photos and images, obviously. And, there's always that sense of, and I think it's very powerful in politics, and it's often been weaponized to great effect by demagogues historically and even currently. I mean, some can come to mind. I'm not going to name names, but I'm sure that you can all think of some, not just here in the US, but worldwide. I mean, the world over. It's something that I think transcends a particular country or state and culture and goes to a more human sort of tendency for looking back at the past and looking at things oftentimes in either a rose-colored glasses or glorifying maybe events that we didn't even live through, but they just seem, and the people who I've been around that have discussed these events, like the gentleman who definitely said that things were much simpler way back when, much like my parents say, and much like I've thought about my own childhood versus the situation now as someone who grew up in the 2000s and, I mean, had a pretty decent childhood for what it's worth. I loved growing up here in Staten Island, and listen, it wasn't all puppies and rainbows, but you know how adolescents, especially males, can be. I'm sure any of you could say, if you're one like myself who just recently is out of that phase at 25 now, or someone who's experienced that as a parent or sibling or something like that, or a friend, I'm sure that, or someone in that group still, I mean the new Gen Z or Gen Alpha people, I'm sure that you all have your own opinions on that, and good for you all. But I think it really goes to show, though, how we're currently living in an era right now of great transition, where the vestiges of the old are sort of melding and obviously conflicting as well as converging with the new. And we're about to head into a broad, I mean, I guess in lack of a better term, not to make it cheesy, but what first comes to mind to me is a brave new world where, I mean, as the book had been titled, the famous one, as well as the name of the Civilization 5 final expansion pack for nerds like myself, video game nerds who, well, they grew up, played that instead of probably doing their homework, or, I mean, at least I can say that for myself oftentimes. Even though I was fortunate enough to pass my AP US History exam, I spent much of the time playing that game rather than studying or doing homework, but I'm sure my teacher would not be a fan of me saying that still, but I said it back then, and I think even now, it just goes to like the point that I was saying that history ultimately is a very important subject to learn about, obviously, and also the fact that history is not just the past. It's not just prologue. It is a part of us, and understanding the past is how we can, shape the future and best prepare for it, as well as be able to understand, especially now in the present, where there's a deep sense of waywardness, I think, in our society at the moment, especially if you're an American like myself. And it's important to think about these things and have introspection and not just to try to have this sort of default two-dimensional view on these things, or the worst comes to worst, I would say, is to just live in the moment, as some would say, the whole YOLO type of thing, which I've never been a fan of that concept of you only live once. I mean, maybe. I mean, who knows what happens in the next plane of existence? And I mean, whatever, I think it's a conversation that we could talk about in itself. I'm personally a pantheist and someone who was brought up as Roman Catholic, so I have maybe a bias myself, but I truly believe that there is something beyond us. And I think right now we are having a current identity crisis in the US, as well as a crisis overall within the West as a whole, in terms of the meaning of what it means to live in this so-called modern world. And we're grappling with it right now in different ways, some better than others, but there are a lot of problems, and I think oftentimes about these things, and I hope you all do too, but it's sometimes good to get back to home base, return to one's roots, and to come back to the beginning sometimes among the tumult, to try to organize oneself and try to, piece together like a puzzle the different sort of factors and variables going on, and have discussions like this, which the one that I had today is only thanks to the fact that I encountered this gentleman. Maybe I will never again. Maybe I will in the future. Hopefully, he appreciated the conversation as much as I have. I'm sure if he was listening, he would know what I'm talking about. But nonetheless, I hope that you all have been thinking about these types of things and preparing for the future, as well as trying to do your best to understand the past and your particular sort of placement in the broader scope of human affairs. But with that being said, not to go on too much more of a ramble, I hope you all have enjoyed this particular segment. And if you have, please make sure to subscribe if you're here on YouTube, as well as click the bell notification icon. Comment below what you think. I'm looking forward to having a discussion. And if you encounter me in real life, you can do that too. I much prefer to talk over in person. I'm gonna have another segment soon about why I've significantly reduced my social media usage in the last few years, and why I believe you all should probably too, because I think it's driving most of us, at least the ones who don't know really how to moderate or put it in its proper context, a little bit crazy. But who am I? I mean, I'm just somebody with an opinion here. And if you enjoyed that, I hope you will subscribe on YouTube, as I mentioned before, follow my podcast, as well as check out the links in the description, whether you're on the podcast or the YouTube page, to see my recommendations, as well as additional resources like social media, as well as my blog that I'm going to start soon. And I promise more videos and content will be on the way very soon. So if you did enjoy all that, let me know what you think. And for now, I'll catch you all in the next segment I make real soon. This has been Tom again. We're Get Nuanced with TJC, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace out, and stay safe in the meantime.